Hello, this is the final video in my series about the Moog Subharmonicon and ways of recreating it using software. I really would like a second Subharmonicon so I can run them in stereo, and I'm saving for a second one just for that reason. But in the meantime, I wanted to see if I could make one, and guess what? You're listening to it. In this video, I'll be looking at the polyrhythm generators and sequencers of the Subharmonicon. In the first two videos, I covered how to create a subharmonic generator and did a deep dive into the envelope generators. If you missed those, I suggest you check them out before you watch this one. This is going to be a long video, so I'll put an index in the description, as well as links to the other videos and VCV Rack. Before I get to the tutorial, let's have a listen to the software Subharmonicon. Let's do a quick overview of the Subharmonicon's polyrhythm generator and sequencer. The Subharmonicon has a master clock controlled by the tempo knob. The output of the clock is sent to what they call 4 rhythm generators, but are in fact 4 clock dividers. This is where things get a little complicated, and I'll get into greater detail later when we experiment with the polyrhythm generators. But simply, the output of the clock dividers are assigned to one or both of the 4-step sequencers. The sequencer's clock outputs are sent to a logic processor, which by default is an OR algorithm but can be changed to XOR by MIDI. The output of the logic processor is sent to both the VCA and VCF envelope generators. The pitch output of the sequencers is sent to a quantizer, but we have control over the CV range via a little button which constrains the voltage to either plus or minus 1, 2, or 5 octaves, so we need to insert an attenuator before our quantizer. Output of the quantizer is of course sent to the oscillators. So here's the rhythm generator's clock divider and sequencer assignment buttons I just mentioned. And here are the quantizer attenuation buttons. Buttons on the top attenuate the pitch range, and the button on the bottom constrains to certain tunings. 12, which is chromatic, and 8, which is like a regular major scale or mode of a major scale, although there are only 7 notes in a major scale. I found that a bit confusing. I guess they're accounting for the root on both top and bottom octaves. I don't know. Got to look into that. Anyway, we can select equal or just temperament tunings. Equal temperament is what we're used to hearing in Western music. Ratios between notes are adjusted mathematically, so tuning is equal across all 12 keys. Just temperament is based on the simple ratios we learned in the first video while talking about overtones. Okay, since the Subharmonicon uses logic to generate polyrhythms, we should do a quick review of the 3 basic logic algorithms. Basically, logic modules compare 2 inputs, then output a result based on different algorithms. Some fancy logic modules have a threshold control to determine at what voltage value the comparison will occur, but the majority of modules don't, so we won't worry about that for now. We'll just look at high and low values. In terms of a gate signal, for instance, that would be open and closed. Okay, and looks at the values of 2 inputs and outputs a high gate or CV value only when both inputs are high. So it's useful, for instance, if you want to sum some trigger signals. OR, which is the default on the Subharmonicon, compares two inputs and outputs a high gate signal only when one or more inputs are high. So OR is a good algorithm to use and works well to compare multiple inputs. You'll see the algorithm used in a lot of modules which compare multiple signals, like maths, or obviously the Subharmonicon here. XOR compares the inputs and outputs a high value only when one of the inputs is high. So again, this algorithm can be used to compare more than just two input signals. And that's a crash course in logic. Seems simple when you look at it like that, but there's more to it, as you'll see. Okay, let's put theory to the test and check out how logic works in reality. I've got 3 basic VCOs by VCV. They're all patched into a voltage-controlled mixer by Bog Audio. We'll be using this as our VCA for now, as well as a mixer, of course. I've got a master clock, clocked by Impromptu, with 2 different clock divisions patched into the level inputs on the VC mixer, as well as patched into channels 1 and 2 of the scope up here, which is pretty good little scope from Count Modula. I'm going to use the VCV logic module. The outputs of the clock are also patched into the 2 inputs on the logic module. The output of the logic module is patched into the scope on channel 4 at the bottom and is triggering the 3rd VCO in the mixer. Let's mute the logic channel for now and first take a look at the 2 clock outputs on channels 1 and 2 so we can hear and see what the logic modules will be comparing. One clock is twice as fast as the other, so we're getting quarter notes from one, which is playing the low C, and eighth notes from the other, which is playing a G. Let's start with the AND output of the logic module. As we just learned, the AND algorithm outputs a high gate when both inputs are high. Easy to see on the scopes. In regular music notation, that would be quarter notes. Okay, let's give the OR output a try. Again, we just learned that OR outputs a high signal when any inputs are high. We're getting eighth notes from our logic module this time. Let's give the XOR a try. As mentioned, Subharmonicon can be switched to XOR. So XOR outputs a high signal when only one input is high. Okay, something weird is happening. Let's solve the output of the logic module. What we should be getting is offbeats only from the logic module, but we're getting something like this. If we can take a closer look, it's pretty easy to see what's going on. We're getting our offbeat triggers as we'd expect when clock 2 is by itself. So these real short triggers are happening because the gate signal on channel 1 is slightly, barely even noticeable to the human eye slightly, longer than the gate signal on channel 2. So for a split second, channel 1 is high when channel 2 is low. So XOR decides to output a high gate. Okay, so gate length is important if we're going to use logic. You may have already noticed that before I started this video, I had already adjusted the pulse width or gate length of the clock on channel 1. I tried to get it the same length as 2, but obviously didn't. Let's shorten the gate length of channel 1 and see what happens. Go down 1 to 25%. That's better, but it's still triggering every once in a while. Just for fun, let's play around with gate length. We can get all kinds of different rhythms and feels this way. I'll bring up channel 1, playing quarter notes so we have a better reference. That's cool. If you're not getting the results you'd expect from a logic generator, it's probably because of gate length. If we go a bit shorter, we can get swing eighths. Cool. So we can use gate length to get different rhythms and feels, even if we have 2 very simple rhythms like quarters and eighths going into the logic module. When the logic module was patched directly into the VCA like that, the short unwanted trigger was actually barely noticeable when the other oscillators were playing. But that will change if we patch the output of our XOR into an envelope generator. Now that barely noticeable little blip is triggering the envelope, and it's definitely noticeable now. Maybe that's okay for some things, but we've got to sort this out. But before we do, let's take a look at how this envelope will behave with our current setup. If I increase the fall time on the envelope, it doesn't have time to complete its full cycle and rings through between triggers. If fall time is decreased, the double attack is even more noticeable. And if the envelope has retrigger, like a lot of physical modules, then it will start outputting high gates as long as the gate signal from the logic module is high. It will go all the way up to audio rate if fall time is short enough. That actually sounds pretty cool. Could be useful in a patch, but obviously not what we want for this. Now, if we turn retrigger off, let's see what happens. If the fall or decay time is too long, it won't trigger on the actual trigger that we want. That's no good. So this is obviously going to be an issue. With everything set up like this, we'd be getting slightly out of time results from our logic module. Of course, gate length won't just affect the XOR output, it'll affect them all. Let's try OR and increase the gate length of clock 2. Now instead of the expected eighth notes, we're getting quarters. Again, variations in gate length could be a really cool way to get different rhythms in a patch, especially if you modulated the pulse width of your clock with an LFO, for instance. You could get all kinds of interesting rhythms, but it won't work for our Subharmonicon recreation. Okay, let's see how the Subharmonicon overcomes this issue. Pretty obvious, it uses triggers instead of gates. Triggers are super short or narrow pulse waves, so pulse width will never be an issue. If we compare a trigger to our clock signal, the difference is pretty obvious. Alright, since I've already got the Subharmonicon patched into VCV, let's take a closer look at the rhythm generators, which, as mentioned, are just clock dividers. I've got the Subharmonicon clock patched into scope channel 4, Subharmonicon's trigger output, which is the output of the internal logic algorithm in default state, that is OR, is plugged into channel 3 of the scope. The clock output of Subharmonicon's sequencer 2 is in channel 2, and the output of sequencer 1 is in channel 1. Let's start by comparing sequencer 2's out and the clock. There's our Subharmonicon clock, again sending triggers, not gates. In case you're wondering, the clock out is actually triggering a mother 32, so we can keep the clock and triggers separate. If you remember, the Subharmonicon sums all outputs to a single VCF and VCA, so we can't have separate envelopes for different sequencers. So in other words, I'm just using the mother so we can hear the clock separate from the sequencers. I can use any of the clock dividers to clock a sequence, so let's use Rhythm 4 to clock sequence 2. With the rhythm trim pot fully clockwise, the output is the same as the clock. The clock dividers are set up to work very much the same as the subharmonic generators in the sense that they divide the clock by 16 different whole integers. That was 2. Now you can hear we're getting 3. 4 should be next. Let's go for 5. And 6. I don't need to go through all these. You get the idea. Let's just go fully counterclockwise. Okay, 1. 16. So that's easy enough to understand, but let's take a look at what happens when we use more than one sequencer or clock divider. I've got rhythm 1 and 2 assigned to sequencers 1 and 2 and have it set up with the same simple rhythm I used in the logic demonstration, quarters and eighths. The output we are hearing is the trigger output on channel 3, and because the Subharmonicon uses OR, we're getting the expected rhythm, eighth notes. So as you can see, the Subharmonicon is outputting a trigger when either of the triggers are high. Let's change up one of the clock dividers. Cool, it's working as expected. Let's speed it up. It'll sound cooler at a faster tempo. And let's get rid of that clock. Obviously, even with just 2 rhythm generators, there's going to be a ton of rhythmic options. Let's put that clock back in just so we have a reference. Remember, the clock output is 4 pulses per beat. I love this thing, it's just so much fun. Okay, let's see what happens if we add another clock divider to sequence 2. We'll use rhythm 4. Awesome. Okay, why not add another one to sequence 1? So it's easy to see on the scope that a trigger is sent to the VCA whenever there is a trigger from either of the sequencers. All right, back to VCA, let's compare trigger widths. Here's the gate length we started with. VCV is way wider. I'll bring the pulse width down to try to match them. Okay. Now, the problem is at least with this module, if the trigger is at 1 or 2%, the envelope misses some of the triggers. But it seems to work okay at 3%. But another issue is pulse width is rate dependent. At this speed, it works out, but you'll see if we slow down the clock, our pulse width is going to be wider, and we may get the same issues we were having before. Let's zoom in so we can get a better look at that. So changing pulse width on the clock is not going to work for us. We could run into trouble, like I said, so we need to find another solution. By the way, don't worry about the timing issues here. That's just a computer latency thing that we'll sort out later on. So there are, of course, modules that will take a gate signal and convert it to a trigger. VCV has one, and it works fine, but we need at least 2 modules to do it. Nothing wrong with that if we're using software, but could be an issue with hardware. So I'm going to use one of my favorite modules instead, Mutable Instruments Stages. Or I guess this one is actually Audible Instruments Segment Generator. Not going to get into what I think about mutable clones. I just wish Emulation did not feel the need to shut down Mutable Instruments. Those are some of the most inventive and amazing modules ever constructed. Okay, gear politics done. I talked a little bit about Mutable Instruments Stages in my last video. Again, one of my favorite modules. Last time I used it as an envelope generator. This time we're going to use it for a few things, starting with the hold stage. A hold stage is selected by the little button on top of the slider. The red LED represents a hold stage. Hold segments stay at a constant but CV controllable voltage for a programmable amount of time, so we'll use them as gate to trigger converters. If a hold segment stays at a constant voltage, we can use it to decrease the pulse width for a wave by shortening the amount of time it holds that voltage. Okay, so let's patch it up. Clock output to stage 6 trigger input, and gate out to the scope and the trigger input of our envelope generator. And we'll patch our envelope out into our VCA. Now we have to set up stages. Click on the button twice to turn it red so we have a hold stage. Oh, gotta unmute that, and let's hit run. Okay, nothing has changed yet. We still have a wide pulse. But if we turn the trim pot to the left, we can shorten the pulse width. Looks good. This, by the way, will work at audio rates as well, so you can use the same method to alter the pulse width of a sound wave. Super cool. Looks like we're getting some latency again. That'll be more obvious when I zoom in, but remember, we can ignore that. That's just because I'm clocking the Subharmonicon with VCV and then sending it back in. Anyway, let's double check that things work at different tempos. Yep, looks good, but let's zoom in just to be sure. And that latency is obvious there, but the good news is our triggers are the same length. I should do a video about hybrid setups and how to deal with latency, but I'll save that for another day. Okay, we may need another gate to trigger later in the patch, so I'll set that up now. Because we're going to use stages for some other things, we need to think a little bit ahead. Stages can be a bit tricky to patch because its behavior may change based on what is patched where. Alright, now let's use one of the other stages as a clock divider. In the first video of this series, I hinted that envelope generators or LFOs can be used as clock dividers, so let's set up a couple of stages to do that. In the last video, I talked briefly about ramp or green segments in stages to build envelopes. As you know, an LFO is basically just a looping envelope. We could do some cross-patching to set that up, but Emulation has our back and made it so any stage can loop by simply long pressing the little button. So a flashing green segment is an LFO. Let's patch the output into a scope and take a look. Okay, we've got a sine LFO. The trim pot up here will control the shape of the LFO. Since we want a clock signal, we need a pulse wave, so turn it all the way to the right. We're going to need at least 2 of these, so let's do the same as stage 3. And let's convert these to triggers using stages 5 and 6. There we go. So now all we have to do is patch our master clock into the gate inputs for both LFOs, and we'll have 2 clock dividers with trigger outputs. Let's try it out. The slider on this stage will control our clock divisions, and like the Subharmonicon, we'll get divisions by whole integers. There's 2. I'm just going to speed up the clock here. Still on 2. Okay, let's go for 3. Perfect. And we can go all the way down to 4. Now we've run out of room on our slider, so we can only get 3 divisions plus the initial tempo, of course, but we can get 3 multiplications as well. So we actually have a total of 7 divisions, not the 16 that are possible on the Subharmonicon. So we could use another module as our clock divider, of course, but we can cheat. We can use the different outputs on our master clock and send them to separate stages. Now we have way more than 16 options if we need them. Okay, so I've loaded up the VCV patch we left off with in the last video when I talked about envelopes. To recap, I've got 2 VCOs and 4 envelope generators, which are acting as subharmonic generators. All outputs go to a mixer, out of the mixer to a filter, and out of the filter to a VCA. I covered all of this in the first video of the series. Last video, we added envelope generators, so I've got 2 more Bog Audio AD envelope generators and 2 slew limiters to help with envelope shape and trigger behavior. So now we're all caught up. So let's add our polyrhythm generator to the patch. Let's start with our clock and set the clock multiplier to 4, so it's sending 16th notes like the Subharmonicon. Next, I'll add in stages for our clock dividers and gate to trigger converters. I'll patch clock into both LFOs to clock them and out of the LFOs to the gate to trigger converters. Next, I'll add a logic module and patch the output of each clock divider into logic A and B inputs. The logic outputs will go to the trigger inputs of both envelope generators. And lastly, I'll set up the scope so we can see what's happening. The output of clock divider 1 will be in channel 1 of our scope, clock divider 2's channel output in channel 2. Channel 3 is our logic or output, which is triggering our VCA and VCF, and we'll hear that later. Channel 4 is the clock output, just so we can see what's happening. All right, let's hit run and see what happens. All right, it's working. Everything looks good on the scope. We can see the 2 clock dividers and the output of logic, and everything is making sense. And it sounds pretty good as well. Oh, since I got both clock multipliers stages above 50% mark, they're acting as multipliers, so we'll bring the clock division back to 1. That's better. And let's experiment more with the clock divisions. Yep, starting to sound like a Subharmonicon. But to be honest, I'm not too crazy about stages as a clock divider in this patch. There's too much space between divisions on the slider, and it's not easy to get the odd integer divisions, which are really the fun ones. We'll have to rethink that. But we're not done with polyrhythm generators anyway. The Subharmonicon has 4 clock dividers that are assignable to either sequencer, resulting in a lot more rhythmic options. But the first step is to see how the Subharmonicon's clock dividers interact when assigned to a single sequencer. So patching the clock out of the Subharmonicon, sequence 1 and sequence 2 clock outs, and finally I'll take the trigger out as well, and I'll patch these all into the scope in VCV. Sequence 1 is channel 1, sequence 2 channel 2, trigger on channel 3, and clock on channel 4. Okay, we'll start the clock, and there's our clock triggers. And I'll go through each clock divider and see what divisions we have them set at. Okay, that's dividing clock by 2. Rhythm 2 is dividing the clock by 4. I'm sending these all to sequencer 1, by the way. Rhythm 3 is dividing by 3. And I think I have rhythm 4 set to 5. Alright, so we've already seen how things work if we're using a single clock divider on each sequencer, but the question is, what happens if I assign multiple clock dividers to a single sequencer? So we've got rhythm 2 on sequencer 1, let's try rhythm 3 on sequencer 2. And now let's see what happens if we switch rhythm 3 to sequencer 1. We're getting the same rhythm. So the resulting triggers are the same. So that means that the logic algorithm OR is used once again to determine the sequence clock outputs if multiple clock dividers are assigned to the same sequence. Cool. Now we just have to figure out how to do that in VCV. I wasn't crazy about stages as a clock divider in this patch. It worked fine, but it was a bit tricky to get the divisions I wanted quickly on the fly, so going to use AD envelope generators as clock dividers instead. I'm using the same Bog Audio simple 2-stage envelope generators I've used a ton of times in this patch already. I've kept stages in this patch as gate-to-trigger converters. I've set up 4 stages like that. I've added plats down here in the corner. It's not going to be used in the actual patch, just as a sound source for the clock, so we can clearly hear the subdivisions. Other than that, everything's the same as before. Let's hear plats. Got it on a kick drum algorithm. Again, it's simply outputting the clock so we can hear it. It's on channel 4 of the scope. Alright, so let's see how these envelope generators work as clock dividers. I explained how this works in a previous video, so we'll just check to see how many divisions we can get. If you want to know how it works, check out the first video in the series. As I increase the fall rate, we should start to get divisions. There we go, dividing by 2. Three. And there we have 4. Oh, I forgot to tell you how I patched this. So clock out to the trigger input on the envelope generator, and envelope out to stages gate to trigger converter, out of stages in the logic A input. Logic output is still patched the way it was before into our VCAs. And I'm just going to crank up the fall on the envelope generator and see how many divisions we're actually getting. Oh, I already lost count. Okay, there's a trigger. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. 22! So that's more than the Subharmonicon that gets 16. Don't know if I'll ever go that far, but you never know. Anyway, so I'm going to patch up the other envelope generators so we have 4 clock dividers. I'll patch them the same way we did the first one. And for now, I'll patch out of stage 5 into input B on our logic generator. So we've got 2 clock dividers in this patch with another 2 ready to go. Let's patch those in the scope so we can see what's going on. And let's change the master clock multiplier to 4, just like on the Subharmonicon. Yeah, let's mute that clock. And let's adjust our envelopes a little bit so we can get it sounding more like a Subharmonicon. There we go. Very Subharmonicon-ish. So with this setup, if we want to switch rhythm generators, all we have to do is move the patch cable to a different output on stages. Okay, that works alright, but it's a bit of a pain for live playing, and it hasn't solved our multiple clock dividers per sequencer issue. We could of course use the CV inputs on the envelopes to modulate the clocks. The Subharmonicon itself has CV inputs for the exact same thing, so we should probably save those inputs then if we're trying to do our best to recreate it. So, more work to be done. So I've moved things around again, trying to keep things easy to see as possible. Nothing has changed. I've just brought the envelope generators / clock dividers down here. So we need a way to easily switch between and assign clock dividers to multiple destinations. Sounds like the job for a matrix mixer. And luckily in VCV, we've got a great free one from Count Modula that is perfect for this. If you've never used a matrix mixer before, it's easy to understand. Simply, there's multiple inputs with multiple assignable outs. Usually a matrix mixer uses a potentiometer. This neat little module uses switches. So with this, we can assign the output of any of our clock dividers to any of the outputs with a simple click of the mouse. So I'm just going to patch all the outputs of our clock divider into the inputs on the matrix mixer. But now I need another logic module, one that will be able to compare 4 input signals so that I can send any combination of my 4 clock dividers to it to generate a clock pattern for my sequencer. And this little beauty from Count Modula is perfect for what we need. Remember that OR will output a high gate signal when any of the inputs are high, so OR algorithm works great for comparing multiple inputs. All I have to do now is patch my matrix mixer outs to the 4 inputs on the logic module. And I'll take the OR output of the logic module and patch it into the A input on our master logic module. This module is still going to be used to compare triggers from each of our 2 sequencers. And I'll patch the out of our sequencer logic module into channel 3 on the scope. And if I hit run, only the clock is playing. It's just like the real Subharmonicon. If we want a sequencer to advance, we have to assign a clock divider to it. So let's do that with our matrix mixer. That's Rhythm Generator 1 with sequencer. Let's try Rhythm 2. Cool. Okay, let's combine 1 and 2. Hooray, it works! Okay, so now I can assign any of the 4 clock dividers to a single sequencer with a single click, just like the Subharmonicon. This is so cool. Working great. All right, so on the Subharmonicon, there's 2 sequencers, so we need to duplicate this setup for the second sequencer, so let's do that quickly. And the output of this logic generator will go to input B on the master logic generator. Okay, let's try it out. Channel 1 on the scope is Polyrhythm Generator 1. Channel 2 on the scope is Polyrhythm Generator 2. Channel 3 is our master logic output, and channel 4 is the clock. So I've just got 1 rhythm generator running now. Let's see what happens if we add another one. Cool. I'm so happy this is working. We've done the hard part. The next step is just simply adding sequencers. So let's have some fun with the polyrhythms before we do that. Alright, we're almost there. We've learned how to create subharmonic generators. We've matched envelope shapes and trigger behavior with our hardware Subharmonicon. We've learned how logic works and how to create polyrhythm generators from 4 assignable clock generators. And as you hear, they sound great. All we have to do now is add a couple of sequencers and we're done. So I've cleaned up the patch again. Turns out there's no need for stages as a gate to trigger converter. This wonderful little matrix mixer has a gate to trigger switch built right into it and it works perfectly. But it's good to know how to do that anyway. I've never seen a hardware matrix mixer with a trigger switch, so at least now we know how to do it if we're using hardware. So let's add in those sequencers. The Moog Subharmonicon has 2 4-step bipolar sequencers, so let's use this 4-step sequencer from Bog Audio. The sequencer will be clocked by the output of our first polyrhythm generator and out of the sequencer to the pitch input on our first oscillator. So this is our first channel. Let's see how it works. And let's dial in a sequence. Okay, well, that's a little weird. but so is the Subharmonicon. But we're going to need more control or this thing is going to be impossible to play. The Subharmonicon itself has a quantizer, so let's add in one of those. And you just patch this the same way you'd patch a quantizer in any old patch, sequencer into the quantizer out to the VCO. Okay, well, it's still a little wild. The Subharmonicon has built-in attenuators that constrain the sequencer output to plus or minus 1, 2, or 5 volts, so 1 octave up or down, 2 octaves up or down, or 5 up and down, which is a 10-volt swing, so that one isn't constrained really. So let's add an attenuator to our patch, and we're also going to need a switch. We need a switch so we can easily switch between the different attenuated outputs. This switch by count modula is a 3-to-1, so again, perfect for this patch. It's kind of like they knew what we were doing. The output of the sequencer is going to be malted to 3 different channels on the attenuator. And the output of each attenuator to an input on our switch. Output of the switch goes to the quantizer. And now we need to set up the attenuator so it will constrain the pitch to their proper amounts. It's easy to do this by simply turning one of the steps of the sequencer all the way up and playing the sequencer and adjusting the attenuator until we get an octave. There we go. So I'll do the same for the second channel, except 2 octaves. Cool. Done. And I'll turn the third all the way up because, like I just said, it's not constrained. Okay, that's all set up. This is starting to get pretty exciting. The range button on the Subharmonicon is one of my favorite things to play with, an easy way to get variations in a patch. So I'm excited that we worked that out. Let's try it. Okay, first step, set up a sequence. Oh, and I'm going to put it back on plus or minus 1 octave. I really like this quantizer. It's really cool that you can see the notes the sequence is playing. Wish the actual Subharmonicon had that. You don't have to use your ears. Perfect for the lazy man. Okay, let's go with that sequence and try out our range button. Awesome, it's working. That sounds great. Let's try 5. Yeah, and just like the real Subharmonicon, you can get some wacky stuff with that one. In our version, if you want to constrain it, you can, just with this attenuator, but I like it wacky. Let's add in some subharmonics. Cool. Nice. Okay, Moog Subharmonicon has 2 sequencers, so we again need to duplicate our sequencer quantizer setup. It'll be clocked by our second polyrhythm generator, and its output will go to oscillator 2, and that's it. Okay, let's fire this thing up and play around with it for a little bit before we put our final touches on the patch. Okay, we're near the end. We've pretty much recreated a Subharmonicon in VCV Rack and for free, and I'm actually surprised how much it sounds and behaves like the real thing. It's not perfect, of course. It has its flaws, but it's really fun to patch and play with. But I haven't talked about the CV inputs on the Subharmonicon yet, and they are, of course, a huge part of the synth. There's 32 separate patch points, so a lot of options. There are a few things I think they left out that would really take the Subharmonicon to the next level, but I'll save my criticism for another time. I have the utmost respect for the designers of this little synth. It really is one of the most unique instruments I've ever played. But I bring up the CV patch points because obviously with our modular version we can do almost anything we want. One patch idea that is on almost every Moog factory Subharmonicon patch is modulating the cutoff by one or both of the sequencers. So let's give that a try. With the way things are currently patched, I can only modulate the filter with one thing at a time. So let's start by removing the envelope modulation and replacing it with the attenuated out of the sequencer, just like on the Subharmonicon. So there's not much change in filter modulation, at least with this sequence. That's because, of course, I'm using the attenuated out just like on the Subharmonicon, but the good people of Moog realized this could be an issue and they made a workaround. If you long press the pitch constrain button, the CV output for the sequencer will be unconstrained, but the sequence itself will stay constrained. Cool. Now that's easy enough to do on our patch, just use the sequencer output instead of the attenuated out. Just wanted to bring that up because it's a big part of the Subharmonicon sound. Ah, very cool and very Subharmonicon. Notes are getting cut out with the filter modulation, allowing even more polyrhythms. Super cool. Okay, but I lost my envelope modulation, so I'm going to add in a few Unity mixers so I can have some options for patching later. In place of a Unity mixer, you could use a regular attenuverter or mixer if you wanted. Just going with this because I think it's close to what's on the Subharmonicon. And because this patch is pretty much set, I'm going to lock the module positions so they don't get moved around while I'm trying to turn knobs with my mouse. And I'm going to hide the patch cables. I wish that's something you could do in real life. It seems every patch I do, no matter how careful I am, always looks like a plate of spaghetti. Oh, I forgot to demonstrate our modulation. And without the sequence modulation, yeah, that really adds some life. And like my favorite detective used to always say, just one more thing. Tuning the sequences can be a pain on the Subharmonicon. They have a little next button which allows you to move through the steps one at a time so you can work out your sequences and harmonies. You can trigger each step manually with the trigger button, or you can long press the envelope button to open the VCA. I haven't set up any individual trigger buttons, but we can just open the VCA and step through the sequence with the individual step buttons and dial in the sequence you want. Okay, that pretty much does it. This has been a fun series to put together. I hope you've learned something. I know I certainly have. I hope you put this patch together and have a good time exploring the endless possibilities and I guess frustrations that also come with working with such a weird and unique instrument. But I'm going to finish this video off with a short jam using both my hardware Subharmonicon and our new VCV version. That's it. Have fun.